I'd like to begin by reading a text from the book of Proverbs. If you want to follow me to Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. These two statements, which at first glance appear to be contradictory, give us a balanced approach for dealing with foolishness in a God-honoring way. Verse 4 gives us the rule, and verse 5 gives us the exception, and which one we apply depends on the situation. Most of the time, the answer is verse 4. To answer a fool according to his folly, or to answer a fool according to his own mode of reasoning, it's only going to perpetuate folly. The interchange is never going to end, and you'll just look foolish in the process. But there are times, verse 5, when suffering a fool to speak is too great an evil to bear, and remaining silent might do more harm than good. Think about it. If a foolish remark is never answered, other people might think that the fool is actually wise and that the fool can't be answered, and then they're duped into believing the fool's arguments are true. And so in a case like this, you have to meet the fool on his own ground to stop his stupidity from spreading to other people. And I think this is exactly what the Apostle Paul is doing in the book of 2 Corinthians, beginning in verse 16. I'd like to look at this in three sort of sections today. First of all, Paul's relationship with Corinth. Second of all, Paul's boasting to Corinth. And then we'll make some application at the end. So let's begin here, Paul's relationship with Corinth. And the first point here is that he's rebuilding shattered relationships. Paul's time in Corinth, you can read about it in Acts chapter 18. And compared with some of Paul's other excursions into cities, his time in Corinth was relatively peaceful. It was a good time. There was a lot of growth. A lot of fruit was being born there. Jesus was with him. Normally, Paul would spend a couple days or a couple weeks and he'd be run out of town, people throwing rocks at him. But in Corinth, that didn't happen. He spent about a year and a half there. And sure, it wasn't perfect in Corinth. They had some very serious issues which Paul had to write to help straighten out. But something had happened between the writing of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, because there's a huge difference in the tone and the content and the style of the two letters. Look in chapter 11 with me. Other teachers, who he sarcastically dubs as super apostles, but really they were false apostles, verses 13 to 15. They were deceitful workmen. They were actually servants of Satan and not of Christ. These teachers had infiltrated the church, and chapter 11 and verse 4, they were teaching another Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel. Perhaps because they left out some of the unpleasant parts about discipleship and what it means to follow the Lord, maybe leaving out some important parts about the messiahship of Jesus and what it cost Jesus to become king in the first place. But they were also poisoning the minds of the church against Paul. They belittled his apostleship, they belittled his message, and they belittled his preaching style. And they said basically in chapter 3, if he wants to come back, he needs to send further letters of recommendation. He needs to update his resume, and then we'll think about having Paul back. Now imagine, if you were Paul, how that'd make you feel. You risked life and limb to travel around the Roman world, bringing the gospel to different places. You were the one who came into Corinth preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so 2 Corinthians basically is Paul trying step by painful step to put this broken relationship back together again. But I want you to notice, if you've been with us on Sunday mornings, you will have noticed already that his strategy is not to oppose the false teachers head on. He's writing to the faithful in Corinth to outflank the opposition And he does that by embodying the message of the crucified Christ in his style and in his approach. So rebuilding shattered relationships. How does he do it? Well, he confronts their pretentious attitude. He confronts their imperial pretensions. The city of Corinth had been destroyed about 100 years before Paul had come to it in Acts chapter 18. And then it was rebuilt by the Romans as a Roman colony. And the people in Corinth were extremely proud of living in a Roman colony. They boasted, in fact, there are other writings where they boasted that they were even more Roman than Rome itself, as if that would be a good thing. They prided themselves on their civic status and on their culture and on their schools of rhetoric and wisdom. And this sense of pride had crept into the temple of God, had crept into the church, and it started to influence the thinking and the values of the Christians there. So you could imagine being a Corinthian and being influenced by this kind of thinking. Hey, if they were the new humans, the new humanity in Christ, and they were powerful, and they were wealthy, and they were intelligent and well-educated, living in the cultural epicenter of the world, well then, they were the elite of the elite. They were the top of the heap. So Paul answers this attitude by saying, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. He confronts this prideful mentality by reestablishing what true apostleship is all about. It's not about status. It's not about station. It's not about power. It's not about style. It's about Jesus Christ. And if it's about Jesus Christ, then it's about service. It's about humility. It's about faith and love and grace and truth. So these false teachers are reflecting the surrounding culture of arrogance, and Paul has to set them straight and confront their pretentious attitude. How does he do that? Well, we've been noticing in our class, he's subverting their arrogance by using irony. These false teachers, they had gone to school to learn very sophisticated forms of rhetoric. Well, Paul uses the rhetoric of irony to subvert their arrogance. He actually plays the role of a fool. He embraces it because, to the world's eyes, the gospel is foolish. Look at what he says in verse 16, chapter 11, verse 16. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. He's asking them, accept me as I assume the role of a fool, as I stoop down to the level of these false teachers, so that I can fight the enemy on his own ground, with his own carnal weapon, human boasting. But except Paul uses boasting, and he subverts it with irony. Verse 19. Verse 19, for you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. These words are dripping with sarcasm, are they not? Since you guys are so wise over there in Corinth, surely you can put up with a weak fool like me. Especially considering how well you put up with those arrogant, domineering false apostles that slap you on the face and like to think that they're super important. Me? Oh no, I'm much too weak for that. I could never bear that. I'm not as strong as you guys are in Corinth. That's irony. Do you think maybe they're getting the point? That's Paul's relationship to Corinth. This is how he's approaching it. He's subverting their arrogance with irony, and then he begins to boast. He starts boasting and giving a list of all of his achievements, all of his accomplishments as an apostle. It's like he's reading off his new resume as a true apostle. But as you read the list, he's boasting in all the wrong things. He's bragging about stuff the Corinthians would have been ashamed of. But he's doing it on purpose. He's actually hijacking the style of these super apostles, and he's turning it on its head. He's viewing it through the lens of serving Jesus. Look at what he does in verses 22 to 29. He's essentially saying, I've climbed the wrong social ladder. Later, verse 21b, but whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool, I dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false apostles, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from these other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? And am I not weak? Who is made to fall? And am I not indignant? In Roman culture, you gained power and prestige by advancing your position. If you were a Roman citizen and you were educated, you could climb the social ladder. There's writing about this. It's actually called the course of honor, the cursus honorum. And if you had the means, you could become a tribune, which is a pretty sweet gig. Then you could graduate and be a quaestor, and then you could be a praetor, and then you could be a consul, and then you might become a proconsul, and then you get to move to Rome, and you have a nice cushy job, and you live a very quiet and tranquil life, and you never get your hands dirty because you have slaves to do all your work for you. And then there's Paul. Oh, sure, like the super apostles, Paul was Jewish, verses 22 and 23, but he's in constant trouble with them. He received judicial punishment from the Jews, the 40 lashes less one. He received judicial punishment from the Romans. He was beaten with rods. He received, at the hands of pagans, mob violence. He was stoned in Lystra, left for dead, in fact. He was publicly humiliated as a convicted criminal, even though he was completely innocent. And he's in danger all the time. Weather, not enough food, shipwreck, all the burdens of travel. And then very poignantly in verse 28, I'm anxious about all these different congregations that I've been visiting, because I want them to be with Christ. I want them to be ready. I want them to be established in the faith. Now, the verdict of the ancient world, looking at this resume, is that the gods must despise this person. I mean, obviously, he deserves all this treatment because he's such a loser. But Paul doesn't see it that way at all. He's simply following Jesus. And this is the cost of discipleship for him. And all the things the false teachers were laughing at him for, he's highlighting and he's using as evidence that the power of Jesus' resurrection is at work in my life and in my service to Jesus. Therefore, he happily identifies with the weak. And he even sides with them and defends them. That's what he's saying in verse 29. He climbed the wrong social ladder. Is this what you would put on your resume? That's what Paul put on his resume as an apostle. He won the ultimate anti-medal. He won the ultimate anti-medal. Look at verse 30 to 33. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. And he gives a prime example. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. There's an oath. Whatever he's going to say is going to be super important. Let's hear it, Paul. What is it? At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. The highest medal for military service that the U.S. government bestows upon soldiers is the Medal of Honor, right? Well, the Romans had their own version of this. The highest honor for a Roman soldier was called the Corona Navalis, or the naval crown. Here's Agrippa wearing his. He got it at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And this was a prestigious award. And it was very... there's a story that goes along with this. It was only given to the first man who jumped over the wall and ran toward the enemy. Now, of course, people who did that died. And so you had to swear an oath that you did this, and there had to be other people who can confirm the oath. Well, apparently Agrippa had done so in that battle. You see what Paul is doing here? He's making a mockery of that. It's the opposite of that. He wasn't the first one over the wall running toward the enemy. No, he was let down over a wall and he ran away and he escaped. The climax of my career, he said, it's sealed with an oath. God knows I'm not lying. I'm let down over a wall and I got away. Do you remember the story that he's referencing here in Acts chapter 9? When he first goes to Damascus, that's a different Paul than the one who's leaving, right? He came to Damascus as the hunter. He came to persecute Christians. He left as the hunted. He came with letters from the very highest authority to seize Christians, and he left lowered like a laundry in a basket over the wall. See, Paul's got the Corinthians in the palm of his hand here. He totally subverts their narrative of their beloved Roman culture, and he's rubbing their noses in it the whole time. The stuff you guys think is important is not important, he's saying. Now, if escaping from the hands of the enemy was his highest achievement, his highest spiritual experience was being told no by the Lord. Look at what he says in chapter 12. I must go on boasting, though there's nothing to be gained by it. I'll go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So what is he doing here? He goes on with his boasting. I've had all these amazing spiritual experiences, visions, he says, revelations from God. Now this would have been the stuff that the Corinthians would have seen as proof that Paul really was a super apostle. He was really an elite spiritual leader, and yet Paul tells them, no, my highest spiritual experience in life was praying to the Lord and being told no. Look at how he does it too. Who experienced this? Who experienced this? Verse 2, Paul says, someone in Christ. Who it is isn't important. Obviously, he's talking about himself there. He goes on to say, how did it happen? Paul says, I'm not really sure. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I don't really know. But God knows, and that's what's important. Well, what did he hear with these visions and these revelations? I'm not really at liberty to say, verse 4. That would have been stuff the Corinthians would have really liked to know about. Spiritual church that they were. So he's converting their pride. He's subverting their pride. Verses 5 and 6, though I have every right to boast about this kind of stuff, these experiences, I'd rather boast about something else. I'd rather boast about my weaknesses. What was even more important to Paul than these mystical spiritual experiences was the lesson that he learned in suffering. Verses 7 and 8. I prayed 3 times for the Lord to take this thorn in the flesh, whatever that was, away from me. And 3 times he was told no. And in that no, Paul discovered a power which eclipsed all of his visions, all of his revelations put together. He learned the lesson of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, who also prayed 3 times and lived by the will of his Father. I've never had a revelation. I've never had a vision. I've never been caught up into paradise, in the body or out of the body. But I've learned this lesson. I've been here. Grace works most powerfully when we are what we feel like is the end of our resources. When we're so weak, our prayers are taken up by a God who knows, who understands, who empathizes, who is powerful, who loves us, and He sympathizes with our suffering. He sympathizes with our weaknesses. And we know that He does because He experienced it. And the answer that He gives when we pray to Him in those moments, it might not be the one that you want. It might not come when you want it to come, but it will be the answer that you need, and it will come exactly when you need it. Trust God. Keep praying in those times of weakness. This is part of the mystery of suffering as a Christian. We do not have the grasp on, a grasp on the bigger picture. And we don't have to. That's okay. Because in those moments, we learn how weak and foolish and limited we are. And we learn how strong and wise and capable God is. Because it's in that weakness, as we turn to God and as we trust God, just like Jesus did in the garden, that the power of Christ, the resurrection power of Christ, comes to rest upon us. So he says in verse 11, I've been a fool. You forced me to it. For I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me of this wrong. So here's Paul. He'd been reduced to answering a fool according to his folly, which is so sad, because the Corinthians ought to have praised Paul. They ought to have honored him. They ought to have commended him. And even though he was nothing, he says in his own words, the very least of the apostles, he proved that he was a true apostle. He gave evidence that he was really from God by doing these signs and wonders and miracles, which is more than any of those super apostles could ever claim. And then he ends with this sarcastic apology for not accepting support from the church in Corinth. Oh, forgive me this great wrong I've done you by not accepting a paycheck. What is Paul doing, and what can we learn? He's not just admitting his weaknesses in a kind of begrudging way. He's boasting in them. Because where there are no signs of vulnerability, no signs of costly sacrifice in your walk with Jesus, no signs of suffering, in other words, where there are no signs of the cross, there's no Christianity. That's another Jesus. That's a different gospel. If we follow Jesus, if we live and believe the true gospel, we're going to suffer for it. But the point is, we should boast in those weaknesses, because it's in those moments that we find the strength of God. What is some application we can make here? 3 things very quickly. The gospel generates countercultural living, first of all. Countercultural living. Corinth had allowed the surrounding culture to shape their thinking. Just like Washington, D.C. is pressing in on us. Just like the rat race of your work and the things that you have to deal with at job and the attitudes there are pressing in on you. It's the same kind of thing. Our culture is pressing in on us. Now, Paul, living out this gospel, he confronted that worldly mindset at Corinth. That's what the gospel does. It produces a counterculture, not counterculture in the way that we define it, which is basically, dyeing your hair a weird color, doing the opposite of everyone else, and voting to the left or something like that. That's not the kind of counterculture the gospel generates. The gospel challenges the culture of success around us, the culture of greed and materialism and image. It challenges the fashionable trends. It challenges the acceptable views on morality. Most people see that they understand the world is progressing on moral issues, like sex and gender and abortion. Now that we live in the 21st century, there's no such thing as absolute truth, and religion is just a crutch for the weak and that kind of thing. That's simply not the case. We're not progressing at all on those issues. The world is just as corrupt as it ever has been. We need to be like Paul. We need to live and speak in ways that show up those trends in culture as false. We need to challenge those ideologies as cheap parodies of the truth. They're empty. They have no substance. They do not help a person live their life. They're not encouraging. They're not good for society. How can we do that, though? This is the other lesson we learned from Paul. How did Paul do it? By living a holy and humble life of service in which grace is the power to get things done. Not human strength, not human wisdom, not arrogance, not being the loudest voice in the room. No, our weapons are spiritual, and they're equipped with divine power to pull down strongholds and any lofty opinion that raises itself up against the knowledge of God. I hope that counterculture is alive in this congregation. I hope we're pushing back against the darkness around us. But also countercultural theology. We want to challenge the way the world thinks about God. The world has an idea about God, many false ideas about God. But we're going to have a class on apologetics later in the year, and we're going to take this approach where the kind of classical approach where you lay down a foundation that God does exist, the God of the Bible does exist, and He exists as omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent. And through carefully crafted evidences, we try to convince people that God does exist, and then because God exists and the Bible is true, they should follow Jesus. Well, there's merit to that. But look at what Paul is doing here. He doesn't start with this classical image of an all-powerful God and argue from there. He starts with Jesus and explains who God is in light of Jesus. The most powerful apologetic, the most credible evidence of Christianity is living and speaking the gospel of the crucified Christ, the suffering servant, the sacrificial lamb. All the stuff that these false apostles wanted to leave out. Because the greatest show of God's strength and power and love and grace was that moment when Jesus died on the cross for the sins of the whole world, including yours and mine. And that love and that grace should continue in us. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So we're content with weakness. We're down but not out, right? We're carrying within us the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus might be manifested as we endure all these trials in our life. The most profound theological argument we can make for God is living and speaking a message that to the world is utterly foolish. That's going to surprise people. That's going to raise eyebrows. They're going to wonder about that. It's like what Paul says in the first letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? God brought to nothing things that supposedly are, through things that are viewed as nothing. The wisdom of God, or the foolishness of God is wiser than men. The weakness of God is stronger than men. The last thing here is countercultural lament. Paul's life was a life of joy and celebration, sure, but it was also a life of lament, wasn't it? And God mourns over the state of the world because of all the sin that is rampant around us. And He calls on us to express that grief with Him. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And as we groan with the pain of the world through prayer and lament, Paul says in Romans 8, somehow God's Spirit is also involved in that groaning with us. But it's a hopeful lament, because we believe in a future where there's a judgment, and evil and death will be eradicated. And there's a future we can live on with God and all the people who love Him forever. So it's not a hopeless lament. It's a hopeful lament. It's an encouraging thing. And so today, every single face in this auditorium is hiding some kind of secret sorrow. But know, brother or sister, that part of our faith is worked out through expressing that sorrow, just like Paul is doing here. And all of this pain is somehow shared by Jesus and is taken up by Jesus. And it's taken up by Jesus in hope. Because if we suffer with Him, Paul says we will also be glorified with Him. So we need to be like Christ, going out into the world as His wounded healers. Bring the gospel with us, the light of the gospel. And all of this together, countercultural living, the way that we live, countercultural theology, the way we think about God, and countercultural lament, the way we express our sorrows, expressing it in hope, that challenges all of our culture's ideas about success and power and wisdom. That's shining your light. That's being the salt of the earth. And so may our message and our life echo the words of Paul. Let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. The foolishness of God is wiser than men. The weakness of God is stronger than men. And there might be someone here who has never admitted that they're weak. Let me tell you, you are weak. As our brother prayed at the beginning, the only reason you have air to breathe today is because there's a God in heaven who controls the world. The only reason you have food in your refrigerator and you have life in your body is because a God created you. You're fearfully and wonderfully made in His image. But you are so weak without Him. And if you want to be strong, then you need to admit your weakness. You need to come to Jesus for strength. You need to come to Jesus for mercy and forgiveness. And He gives that to us because He went to the cross to die for us, showing us what true strength looks like. True power. And that's His grace. If you need to respond to the gospel by being baptized, or you need the prayers of this church for any reason, now's the time to do it as we stand and sing.